Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Corporate Governance and Audit Committee. My name is Councillor Paul Ray, and I will be chairing today's meeting. The meeting is being live streamed to the council's website, so that the public, should I say, can reserve the meeting without needing to be present. I'll now invite members and officers to introduce themselves. So please turn off your microphone once you've introduced yourself, and we will go in this direction.
Hello, I'm Kate Sadler and I'm the lead officer to the committee.
Hello, it's Councillor Illingworth from Kirkstall Ward.
Good afternoon, everyone. Councillor Paul Truswell, Middleton and Belle Isle.
Good afternoon, Councillor Morel Mitchelly, Kippex and Methley Ward.
Hi, good afternoon. Councillor Gore Almus from the Beeston and Holbeck Ward.
Hi, I'm Councillor Jane Dowson, I'm Chapel Allerton Ward, and I'll be the permanent replacement for Councillor Smart. So it's my first meeting, go easy on me, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Louise Booth and I'm the Head of Audit.
Jonathan Foster, Senior Audit Manager.
Good afternoon, Emma Camillo Price, Intelligence and Policy Service on behalf of Tim Rollett, who sends his apologies.
Good afternoon, Aaron Linden, Acting Head of Information Governance and Data Protection Officer.
Hello, Mary Hasnip, Head of Finance within Corporate Financial Management.
Kieran Dennett, Head of Procurement and Commercial Services.
Good afternoon, Perminda Setti, Grant Thornton, External Auditors.
Afternoon, Billy Flynn, Leeds. I'm from Leeds, yeah. Adlan Wharf, Dale Ward. Peter Harron, Bradford.
University challenge, Bill.
Difficult question. Oh, yeah. Peter Harron, Alderley Ward.
Jackie Shemill, Horsforth Ward.
Rick Downs up in Eden Ward, and I'd like to give my apologies. I need to leave at 3:30, I'm afraid.
Good afternoon, Debbie Alden. I'm the clerk to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you much, everyone. So moving to item agenda number 1.
Thank you, Chair. Under agenda item 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under agenda item 2, there is no exempt information this time. Under agenda item 3, there's no late items, but there has been some supplementary information in relation to agenda item 10, which was the draft statement of accounts. I'll get it right. So I hope that everybody's got a copy of that, and I've just passed out some paper copies for those who've needed them. Agenda item 4, could I ask for any declarations of interest? Take silence as there are none, thank you. And apologies for absence have been received from Linda Wild, the independent member. Sorry about that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that. Item agenda 6 and 7, the minutes. First of all, can I ask members, are the minutes a correct record of the meeting held on the 24th of June? Oh, Councillor Truswell.
Yeah, could I just raise one item on page 13, Chair? At the top of page 13, resolve to consider and note the governance arrangements outlined in relation to the Best City ambition. Immediately above that is a very clearly expressed view, which I asked the committee to take, which I think constitutes a recommendation. And I'm not sure, therefore, that the resolution really conveys our discussions. So could I suggest that perhaps that paragraph is made a recommendation as part of the resolution?
We'll get that redrafted accordingly. Any other comments on those minutes apart from in terms of corrections, apart from what Councillor Truswell's raised? I'll take silence as a no. No, okay. where I am now. Moving on to any matters arising, please.
There were a number of briefing notes that have been circulated to the committee over the course of the last month since the last meeting. So one in relation to budget action plans and another on customer satisfaction questionnaires circulated in relation to minute number 8. A note on the use of REPA circulated under minute 9. A note on the liaison with WICA in relation to the Best City Ambition circulated under minute 11. And a further note circulated under minute 13 in relation to whistleblowing practice and policy. In addition to that, members will be aware that the annual report that was approved by committee at the last meeting was received by council on the 20th of July.
Are there any matters arising from those that members, or any questions laid that members want to ask? No. Okay, so moving on to item number 8, the annual assurance report on procurement policy and procedure, and I believe Kieran is presenting this.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, this is the annual report to the committee concerning assurance in relation to the council's procurement function. So the report includes information in relation to the current procurement policies and processes of the council, and it also follows on from a report from that was brought to this committee in November last year, and provides an update on the P2P, so the procured to pay action plan that was part of that November report. In terms of reporting the current position, the detail of that is set out in Appendix A. And just to note the following, I suppose, few key points. In terms of procurement, each directorate's accountable for the procurements that they need in order to secure the outcomes that they're responsible for. But Procurement and Commercial Services corporately sets procurement policies and procedures, provides support in particular with regard to complex procurement activity, and also monitors compliance. In terms of spend, external spend in 21-22, that was 957 million, which was 40 million pounds less than the preceding year, which I think was probably because the preceding year spend would have been inflated in relation to COVID-related spend. From a compliance perspective, which is something that the committee's been particularly interested in over the last few years, the council, I think, continues to perform well. There's no procurement challenges, no formal procurement challenges last year. On contract spend and compliance spend was at 98.5% of overall spend, which was up from 95.6% in the previous year, and I think is sort of very, very good in comparison to other authorities. And waivers of our contract procedure rules were down to 37 from 60 in the previous year, and that's been a sort of an ongoing trend for the past few years. Another area of focus that the committee's been particularly keen on over the last couple of years relates to social value from, well, additional social value that's procured from the council's contracting arrangements. I think on the positive side, we do have a framework in place now that formally requires commissioners to consider opportunities for social value in all the council's contracts, and through that we're now able to accurately evaluate and monitor social value that's been committed by suppliers and that's been delivered. And in Appendix A, you can see that sort of over the last financial year, there's 23 million pounds of additional social value that's been committed, and £1.5 million that's actually been recorded as having been delivered. So we think that that's some good progress with regard to embedding consideration of social value into procurement activities, but we are conscious of feedback that the processes we put in place are actually quite complicated, that there is a cost to those processes to suppliers, and that the focus on those sort of financial proxies that make up those numbers distract from looking at, you know, what is the real added value of those social value outcomes for Leeds. So we're in the process of reviewing our approach to social value at the moment, which includes collaborating with other authorities in the region to see what we can do to come up with something that's, I think, a bit more fit for purpose and responds to those challenges that have been identified. Another measure of social value that we've reported on regularly over the last few years is with regard to local supplier spend and spend with SMEs. In 21-22, that equated to just short of 64% of the total external expenditure. And while that benchmarks well, I think, against other authorities, it is marginally down from the preceding year. So something for us to focus on this year and into the future as well to try and get that going in the right direction again. In terms of the current position, just one final point to note is that we do review our contract procedure rules each year. We're currently in the process of that and hope to have updated contract procedure rules in place in the next couple of weeks. Areas that we're focusing on at the moment are strengthening the rules in relation to delivering social value through procurement activity, focusing on contract management during the procurement processes as well, making sure that we're on top of that, and I'll come on to that in a second if that's okay. And then also facilitating a more flexible and responsive approach to low value procurements where there's a particular urgency or where the spend relates to goods that are for immediate resale in the council's commercial concessions. So that's the current position. The other aspect of the report is in Appendix B, and that's sort of the looking forward as to how we our ambitions to respond to delivering the council's procurement strategy, and also respond to recommendations that were provided from a local government association facilitated peer review of procurement in Leeds. So we've got this action plan that's set out in Appendix B. As I mentioned a moment ago, one area I'd like to focus on particularly, if that's okay, is to do with contract management. There's an enormous amount of research about the benefits of good contract management. So that includes delivering, the desired outputs from the contract, facilitating innovation and best practice, facilitating prompt resolution of issues or disputes, and also realizing financial savings and avoiding unnecessary costs, which is obviously critical in the council's current financial position. And there's research from the International Association for Contract and Commercial Managers that shows that poor contract management can cost as much as 9% per year. So that's things that we're paying for that we're not receiving, or opportunities that are missed. And so in short, the council can't afford to not have effective contract management in place, given the value of external spend each year. So we're in the process of working up a best practice approach to contract management across the council. And we've already recently just launched a module on the council's e-procurement site, which will require that contract management and how the contract is going to be managed to be considered during the procurement process, so that appropriate arrangements are in place by the time it comes to contract award. And it will also help us to gather some high level, admittedly, but some usable management information with regard to how a contract is being managed and performance under that contract. We're reviewing and auditing commercial capability of contract managers across the council, and we've recently secured training for 19 members of staff who are involved in particularly complex contracts at the moment to get training that's delivered by the Government Commercial College as part of the Contract Management Pioneer Programme, which is put together by the LGA and Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And the training's free, but if we hadn't secured that training through that programme, it would have cost about £125,000. So it's pretty detailed in terms of what's delivered. So that was it in terms of what I wanted to draw your attention to, but happy to answer any questions on those issues or any other aspects of the report.
Thank you very much for that. So indication to Councillor Dowson, Trustwell and Flynn. And yeah,
so
I'll take them in freeze if that's okay. But
yeah, probably has nothing to do with you, but I'll ask anyway. A lot of education contracts that we had in previous years gone through this very curious process. In fact, nearly all of them did, called value engineering. So what is being delivered is not necessarily what we've asked for. Do we keep a record of which companies do this the most? Do we review their contracts? How do we manage value engineering? Would be that question.
I'm just going to take these in freeze if that's okay. Councillor Trustwell.
I have more than one question, Chair. On our favourite subject of social value, I do know that there is a review taking place, so I will hold back on one of my questions other than to ask what the timescale for that will be and when you will be reporting back to us. The second relates to our previous discussion about the percentage of contract evaluation that is examined in the light of social value. And currently it's I think we express it as a minimum of 10%, but some other local authorities who probably have been at this a bit longer than us, I think have larger percentages. And so will the review be examining whether we can actually increase that percentage evaluation? My third question, I hate to make this reference, but it's on page 24. And it's 3.12.3, and it says we delivered over 1.5 million of additional social value. And then there is a table of figures. Now, I suppose I should have been listening at the time and I should have a better memory for these things, but these figures actually don't mean a lot to me, just quoted boldly like that. And I think they probably mean even less to any member of the public who might actually be reading this report. My fourth question is, how far can we use our procurement powers to advance the council's zero carbon aims? And if we can, is that included in social value or is that something separate? I know that further on in the report, we've been approached by some providers for an inflation uplift, and I'd be interested in as to how we're considering those to ensure that any decisions are made in an equitable and fair and reasonable way. And finally, Chair, and this is probably an agenda item for a later time, what are the implications and challenges for us of the government's new procurement bill?
I'll ask Kieran to come back on that point because I think that's 7 rather than 3 altogether. So, and then we'll come to other colleagues. No, if I'm going to ask Kieran to respond to this because there's quite a lot, then I'll come if that's okay. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So in terms of the education contracts, any contracts at all. So in terms of value engineering, I mean, typically what I think you're getting at is that we're unable to afford exactly what it is that we're after. So we're sort of trying to get what we can afford, if you see what I mean. So you're kind of reducing the scope or the scale of the services. Is that's typically how
a company bids, they get the contract, and all of a sudden 6 months later you suddenly find out that instead of a pitched roof you've got a flat roof, and instead of 3 classrooms they can only afford to build 2. They can only put 2 toilets in there, not the 4 they promised what they bid for in the first place. I'm just wondering what the process is. Are some companies better than others as well?
So yeah, in terms of any process like that, that should be happening hand in hand with the council. So there shouldn't be any surprises in terms of somebody coming along and saying we're not going to deliver what we've committed to under the contract.
It isn't. We know that. But you give a contract out to somebody and they are bidding for the work that you give them. So how do we manage when they come back to us? So it isn't hand in hand with the council. We're not saying to them, oh, don't put a pitch roof on, put a flat roof. They're saying, I can't afford to do this. I can only afford in the bid to do something completely different to what they bid for in the first place.
I think, just to clarify, I think the question is around, do we have assurance that the contracts that we're signing are actually what they're going to do and that they've not inflated what they're going to deliver to get the contract? So is there what's the insurance process to make sure that actually we're being effectively told the truth?
Yes, so all that should be documented in the contract. So in the contract, we'll have our specification, what our requirements are. And we'll have their proposals in terms of how they're going to respond to deliver those requirements. And if they want to deviate in any way from that, then they'll need to, as I was saying, work hand in hand with us to agree what that deviation might be. If that's not happening, then that's a problem. They shouldn't be coming back to us and just
Don't get, I'm sorry, we're lost in translation here. I know all that, but how do we manage that? Are we happy? I mean, are you happy, or is procurement happy when they come back and they're not going to deliver what they promised and what we'd asked for? Or what's our process for dealing with that? I know we're going to work hand in hand with them, but some other company who bid could have actually delivered all that.
That's Victoria to go in, because I think Victoria's indicating. If you want to,
Yeah,
bob in,
that's all right,
Victoria.
then I'll bring Kieran back in after. We do monitor the contracts, so, and they will have to put a change request in if they're deviating from that contract, and that has to be agreed, and then they pull the funding down, the money down that we're paying them. So therefore, we wouldn't sign it off if they hadn't delivered what they said they were going to do, so they wouldn't get paid. So I think that's how we get the assurance around that they're delivering what they said they're going to deliver. They wouldn't get paid for because they've not delivered it, have they? If they're only providing 2 toilets instead of 4.
I'm going to ask a supplementary question of my own, and then how often do we actually penalise our contractors for that? Because I think the question Councillor Dowson is getting to, there's one thing saying we're going to do it, there's another thing actually doing it. And I think Councillor Dowson's wanting to get to the assurance, are we actually enforcing that? And if so, how often? Am I right, Councillor Dowson? Yeah.
Might be pretty old information, but when I actually, believe it or not, one time was in charge of education, and we did a lot of bills at that particular time. That was one of the big issues. No school we built at the time actually was built to specification. They always came back with a lower spec because they couldn't afford to build the spec we had. Could have completely changed now, so I could be talking really old history, but there's got to be occasions where companies quite rightly say, well, you know, steel's gone up in price, this has gone up in price, we can do it for this price, but we'll have to take that away or take that away. Hand in hand with the council, yes, but could somebody else have done it for the same price? I'm just asking what our process was, and I think you've answered it, to be honest, as much as you can. Thank you.
If you'd like to move on to Councillor Trustwell's questions.
Yeah, so picking up social value, in terms of the timescales for the review, our current arrangements, we've got an external provider of a platform that we use for evaluating and monitoring social value. That contract expires the end of March next year. So in terms of any alternative arrangements, I'd expect that we would need to have them in place by then, and that's certainly what we're working towards. As I say, we are in liaison with other authorities in the region to try and come up with something that we think is a better fit for public sector in general, and to work closely with them to have a more uniform approach across the region. And timescales for that initial piece of work are that it should be complete by the end of October. So we should have a sense then whether or not that's a viable alternative. So that's the timescales. In terms of the percentage that we put towards social value in terms of the evaluation, yes, that is definitely something that is going to be considered as part of that review, and we talked about it the other day with when we met with colleagues from across the region with a view to, you know, what is the right approach, and also trying to get like I say, as closely as possible a uniform approach across the region from us all. The table at 3.12.3 of Appendix A, I think this kind of ties to some of the feedback that we've received, and that I was mentioning before about that sort of focus on the monetary amounts. You kind of then lose the focus on what are the actual outcomes that are being delivered through this social value, and in terms of how you get to those figures, there's a lot of research that's gone into developing proxy values that you attach to things like job creation and volunteering hours and things like that, and cumulatively that adds up to that figure. But as I say, you do lose sight of what the outcomes actually are that are being delivered. So, and I think that's probably, as well as being able to sort of compare, you know, how we're performing on that sort of totality aggregated scale against other authorities. I think probably what members will be interested in is, how many jobs are being created and how many volunteering hours are there and things like that. So that's something we're trying to look to move towards as well. And then in terms of low carbon, yeah, absolutely. Environmental factors and sustainability are included in our Leeds TOMs, so themes, outcomes and measures that we're looking to achieve from social value. One of the big areas of focus is about sustainability measures and environmental measures, and that can all be bid back by tenderers as part of their tender submission. In terms of inflation uplift, I guess it really depends on what the particular contract is and what the particular sector is as to what is fair and reasonable in particular circumstances. And so without going into sort of details about commercial discussions that we've had with bidders, I suppose our first position is to challenge whether any inflationary uplift that's requested is appropriate at all, but then to, I suppose, work through the through the request to understand, what is the actual financial impact on a particular contract. And I'm sort of struggling. I've got a sort of an example that's right at the front of my mind, but I don't want to sort of give away the commercial discussions that we've had in an open forum. But it became obvious from the conversations that we had that some degree of inflation would have been priced into the original price that was bid by the particular bidder. So when they came back saying we want a 20% uplift, it would have been, inconceivable that actually they hadn't already priced in a degree of inflation for their particular contracts, and that they would have expected prices to stay absolutely the same for 5 years. So we do go away and we do challenge and we do try to get to what is a fair and reasonable figure in each instance. And then finally, with regard to the procurement bill, we have fed back in 2021 when the white paper was published. We fed back as part of the consultation. And in terms of what's in the procurement bill, I think we're broadly comfortable in terms of being able to comply with what's there. There's not a massive amount that will have changed from a procurement perspective. There's more flexibility that's built into choose your own procurement processes that you might want to follow, as long as they're being fair and transparent and all those kind of overarching principles. There's a bit more in it in terms of reporting and transparency that will be an extra administrative task for the council, and so there's a bit more to comply with there. But again, I think we feel that we've got that in hand at the moment.
Yeah, if you want to come back.
No, Chair, can I just thank the officer for very lucid and detailed responses, and really in one sentence just highlight the fact that we do need reassurance that any inflation uplifts do need to be agreed on an equitable basis that reduces the council's vulnerability to challenge, and also they will have resource implications presumably.
Yeah, and I think that connects to Councillor Dowson's point about actually the deliverables and whether or not we're actually assured that actually in those procurement contracts, whether it's structural or otherwise, that's been built into the process, because inflation will always happen. And I think there's maybe a piece around assurance for the committee that actually, that's actually happening when those contract discussions are happening. Councillor Flynn.
Thanks, Paul. I've got a couple as well. The first one is there's only one key risk actually identified in the paper, and that's outlined as a procurement challenge, which is, I would have thought, part of the course, really. I was at a scrutiny board earlier in the week, and we got a similar number of papers in with nothing in the key risks sort of element. And given the problems we're facing over the next 12 to 15 months, 2 years or so, I really would have thought there were a lot more key risks than a procurement challenge. If we don't know what the risks are, they're not being outlined to us as a committee, how can we actually sort of address them? The second bit is there's a lot of reviews going on at the moment, Kieran, in procurement, peer review, CPR refresh, P2P review, transformation project, not to mention the bill. What do you see the result of all these actually coming out as, in the sense that the savings that were projected by procurement in the medium-term financial sort of strategy were extremely small in relation to the budget? And I know it's a capital and revenue budget, but it was very small indeed. And I just wonder, you know, where the sort of value for money, saving money, and all the rest of it, given the pressures that we're likely to face over the next 12 months for the cost of living and inflation, etc., where that's going to be. And the last one, social value again, that Paul mentioned. I'm very much in favour of the element of local procurement, local employment and all the rest of it. But given the pressures that the council are going to face once the first half of this year are over, when contracts are going to be reviewed and the war in Ukraine, etc., 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 I wonder how that's going to affect value for money for this particular council. It's all very well us assisting local businesses and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, it's public money, and I just want to be reassured that you know, that we are getting value for money rather than going purely and simply for social value for the sake of social value. Although I do agree with the principle.
I've got a feeling they're going to be meaty responses, so I'll let Kieran respond before we go on to anyone else.
Okay, so in terms of key risks, yes, I think you know, it's a good point that there clearly are other risks in relation to the council's procurement activity. I suppose in terms of this report, it's looking for looking to give assurance with regard to the overarching policies and processes that the council's got in place, and that we're undertaking procurement activity properly and effectively. So that's why that particular risk has been picked out. I think clearly, you know, we talked about inflation. We've talked about you know, tenderers coming back during contract term, or contractors coming back during the contract term and looking to sort of rewind from the positions that have been reached. So those are definitely risks with regard to individual contracts and individual sort of procurement activity. Typically, they'd be covered off with you know, in terms of the risk register for a particular directorate and the risks that they carry, as opposed to a corporate risk. But you're absolutely right. You know, the risks in the broader sense with regard to procurement are wider than just the risk of challenge. In terms of those reviews that you talked about, what we've tried to do, there's a lot that's in there, and so we've tried to bring it all together as part of that action plan that's in Appendix B, and try to make sense of the different pieces of work that we've done and the different bits of research that we've done. In terms of what we're looking to get out of it, obviously it's improving procurement processes, making it as efficient as possible. I think it's part of the overarching core business transformation program. So one of the things that we're really keen to get out of it is systems that talk to each other, that integrate, and so you're not having to input data in 3 or 4 different systems, so that they can pull data from each system to pre-populate. So that should save officer time and resource. And in being able to pull that data from other systems, it gives us better access to management information as well. One of the things, and it kind of ties into what you've been talking about with regard to value for money and savings. One of the things that is a bit difficult at the moment is there's a lot of data cleansing that we need to do manually to understand exactly how much is being spent on different contracts, because the systems that we've got in place are you know, beyond the anticipated time frame for use, and you know, we often don't there's spend that is inaccurately recorded against different contracts. So that, like I said, there's a lot of data cleansing that needs to go on. And then what we had until, say, I think it was about 2 years ago, is that we were comparing spend to the anticipated contract values at the outset of a contract, which clearly is wrong, because you know, the contract's 5 years old. You've got a different budget by the time you get to that stage. So what we should be doing is comparing actual spend to budgeted spend for a particular year, but we just didn't have that data collated and put together to be able to do that. So as part of the overall reviews that we're looking to do, I think getting those systems improved will help massively with regard to all sorts of things, but in particular making sure that we are getting value for money from our contracts and achieving savings. And then in terms of local procurement and VFM, we do still have sort of processes to go through that are intended to make sure that we're testing the market and that we're getting value for money. So we still do need to go out to tender for 3 contracts up to £25,000 for 3 tenderers up to 25,000, for 4 tenderers from 25,000 to 100. And then above that, go through kind of an open process. So we should still be testing the market, and social value is just one part of that. Typically, we'd have a 60-40 split between the quality and the price element of a bid. So if social value currently is only 10% of that, 40% is going towards price. So that is, you know, clearly an important factor in how we evaluate.
I just mentioned, I know we're talking about 21-22 report here, but in terms of the medium-term financial strategy, procurement aren't projecting very much by way of savings at the moment. And I'm hoping that the various reviews that I've sort of mentioned here will result in savings in procurement. I understand systems need to be updated. All of them. I've had a briefing in the last week on it, and I know how ancient they actually are. But that's sort of the bureaucratic sort of side of it. In terms of actually saving money, I just wondered what was in place.
So with the procurement savings, I suppose it's worth picking up that where they first, I suppose, find their way through is through savings that are put forward by directorates and by service areas. So there are procurement savings across the council, you know, quite large savings actually. And in terms of those numbers that we talked about in 21-22, they were savings targets that were kind of added on to the end after all the directorates and all the service areas had identified, all, you know, not necessarily quick wins, but what they thought was achievable. That was an additional target above and beyond. But the savings from procurement necessarily are factored into the overarching service savings, because, you know, how much you need to procure, how much you need to spend externally will also depend on how you actually deliver your service, what standards you've got for a particular service, what level of resource you've got to be able to deliver the service in-house. So it, like I say, necessarily that all comes as part of the package when it comes to the directorate saving proposals.
Well, Marcus, I appreciate Councillor Downs wanted to ask a question before he left. I'll put your mic on.
My apologies. I'll start again. This is my first meeting, and unfortunately it'll be a short one. But back end of June, I received a series of emails from residents, which I've tried to find out an answer for, and I think this might be an appropriate place to ask. Others may have had this and may even know the answer. But it's about fair tax. And the Fair Tax Foundation revealed that between 2014 and 19, a huge 17.5% of public procurement contracts were won by businesses with connections to a tax haven, and they were worth a combined value of 37.5 billion. And the resident, it was like a round robin email, but it was saying that profit sharing shifting is a tax avoidance strategy where multinational firms exploit gaps and mismatches in tax rules to artificially shift income from and profits to low or no tax locations. And to help tackle this tax dodging, I want my council to sign up to councils for fair tax declarations. Many other councils already have. So my question is this something that has been addressed in this council? Is it something we do, or something we could do, or is it something we don't feel is of any relevance? Thank you, Chair.
If you can limit that to the insurance scope rather than the slightly political scope that's in there, please. Oh, no, I don't mean politics with a big P, I mean politics with a small p. It's just around the assurance of how we make sure that obviously the people we're procuring from are appropriate and following the proper, et cetera, if you don't mind. Because I think that's a more broader point that probably might need to be looked at somewhere else.
Certainly. So we've seen there's a Council's for Fair Tax declaration, I think, from a procurement perspective, and in terms of the council's procurement policies, the principles that are outlined in there are absolutely what we would look to that we'd look to sort of comply with. And as a council, we do vet tenderers, and we do financial reviews of the tenderers, but necessarily it's a desktop exercise. I think to go to the degree of actually, thoroughly investigating, these kind of offshore structures that are, but by nature they're designed to be complex to unravel, and they're opaque. We don't have the resource or I think skills in house to be able to go to that degree, but certainly we do what we can in terms of those initial financial reviews and understanding corporate structures.
That's great. Thanks for that. Just one follow-up question. If it was discovered that a contract had been awarded to somebody that was moving tax or moving money offshore, would we then look to remove them from our preferred contractors list, and B, what will we do about any existing contracts?
We don't typically have many sort of preferred contractors lists, so we don't have any sort of we don't have many approved lists in the council. We do have various framework agreements that have been procured that we can call off from. So in terms of our approach, we take it away, and I guess it depends on the particular circumstances, but we would look to review the contract terms and understand what rights we have in that regard, and also under the procurement regulations what opportunities there are under those to make sure that those companies are excluded from procurement opportunities in due course, and obviously that I think will in the not too distant future depend on the precise wording in the Procurement Bill when that becomes enacted.
I think that's one maybe for discussion between this committee and maybe a scrutiny as to where actually that one particularly lies, because it's an interesting one. Councillor Finn, I know you had a follow-up question. If you want to do yours, then I'll bring in Councillor Harrand, if that's okay.
Yeah, it was more a comment than anything else. On your final point, Kieran, about I understand the difference between what you're actually doing and the procurement that's done within the directorates, but the business as usual and strategic review savings that were demonstrated last year and be put forward for the next sort of 2 or 3 years or so aren't huge, again, in comparison with the overall procurement budget for the council, which is just under £1 billion. I think we're talking between 10 and 20 million, I think. It's just a comment. That's not your remit, and it's something we can look at in scrutiny, I think. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, I'd agree. That seems more of a scrutiny one, but I think it's a fair point. Councillor Harrand.
Supplementary to Rick's point, if we applied that rule, we never buy anything from Microsoft. And if you're prepared to run the business like that, I'm surprised. How do you define a local business? Can somebody tell us that? Is it just the registered office? And in response to a question from Councillor Trustworthy, you said, if inflation needs to be applied, we agree a fair and reasonable settlement. Well, who agrees it, please?
So in terms of the first question about local businesses, that's defined by reference to where we're sort of dealing with them from. So in terms of their registered office, it might be that their registered office is London or somewhere like that. But if we're dealing with a local office in Leeds, that's what's classed as a local supplier in that instance. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
I mentioned that just because it has registered office in Leeds doesn't mean that the staff and the wages finish up in Leeds. I mean, a registered office of Leeds City Council's here, but lots of the salaries finish up outside Leeds. The question was, who agrees these inflation settlements? You said fair and reasonable. Councillor Trussell asked you how it worked. I reckon we'll be coming back to this many times these next couple of years. Who agrees it? Is it you?
No, it'd be the directorate that is responsible for the particular contract, so that they're responsible and accountable for their spend.
Where does that emerge for councillors to see?
I'm really sorry, I missed what you said.
How do we know as councillors that that discussion is taking place and this negotiation has taken place? Do you report it to us somehow?
We certainly can report it going forward. I think in terms of depending on what the particular scale of the changes that's being made, then that will affect the particular decision, because you've got to go through the proper decision-making process. So if it was less than £100,000, it would be an administrative decision that just needs to be recorded. If it was above that, then you'd end up in the strategic, the operational decision or key decision territory, which would then have to be published.
Do you want to come in, Victoria?
I was just going to say what Kieran said, it's within directors' delegations, but then there's obviously the decision-making framework that Kieran's just covered. Thank you.
Do you have a follow-up, councillor?
Just interested in how contracts we thought we'd agreed are revised off stage. Who say, yeah, quite possibly, yeah.
Interesting question, councillor Dowson.
I suppose it's a follow-up to a certain extent, and possibly you've covered it before. We get I get complaints all the time about contracts being given to companies outside the area, and that organisation will then subcontract after taking a management fee to organisations in Leeds, because they know Leeds residents and they know what happens in Leeds. Do we put any weight on that? Is this the social value part of it, where we start thinking more about where the work's actually going to be done as opposed to the organisation that's getting the contract?
Yeah, I suppose that the first thing that to say on that is that we do work closely with voluntary sector and businesses in Leeds to try and help them be in a position to put their best foot forward to be able to win council tenders. But in terms of using local suppliers, local supply chains, local employees, yes, absolutely, that's what will come through the social value evaluation section as well.
Councillor Midgley.
Thank you, Chair. Just hopefully a couple of quick queries regarding the waiver of CPRs. Just as a new member to the committee, I'm just interested to know what some of the main reasons are for those waivers. And I notice there's been quite a good reduction in them in the last year. Is there specific reasons for that? Is it down to changing process or more training? Both. Thank you.
So in terms of the waivers of CPRs, that they should be really very few and far between. It should only be in sort of quite exceptional circumstances that you need to waive CPRs, and that you can't follow the processes that are already there and that have already got a lot of flexibility built into them. So really it would be something that was, you know, quite urgent and sort of very last minute, where you couldn't follow the processes through, and that's why you might need a waiver. We still find when of those 37 waivers that I mentioned earlier, actually when you go through and interrogate them, the vast majority of them didn't need to be waivers. They could have gone through the processes that are already there in CPRs that allow flexibility. And over the last few years, we have brought the number of waivers down by training, by working with services to try and make sure that they do understand the, like I say, the flexibility that's already built in, that they can operate within. But there's work that we can still do to bring that down further. Like I say, that number of 37, when you look at the detail, there's an awful lot that didn't need it, either because they're below thresholds, so you can do direct awards anyway, or because they're for contracts where there's only one supplier that could possibly have provided it in any event. So there's more work that we can do to bring that down further.
think just on there was a second question there about why have they reduced quite noticeably. I'm going to assume the word is pandemic, but in terms of obviously because of the year we're looking at a year that was immediately after the worst part of the pandemics. But I'll let you clarify.
Yeah, I think the reason why they've reduced is because of the training that we have done. We put together a package to support, and there's an online training system that can be followed, and we have followed up with individuals and individual service areas that are were previously quite prolific with waivers and explained, you know, like I say, in most instances they don't need them because the CPRs are flexible enough.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions or comments? I think the only thing I'll comment on, I think there's been a theme here around assurance, around, I think, how we're assessing around that, those inflationary pressures and how contractors are via a procurement process are saying all of a sudden there's a cost increase. And I think you obviously highlighted one where we built in a cost increase and then they try to ask for 20% more. So I think members are wanting some more assurance around how that process works, and that we're actually confident that when we're agreeing these contracts across the council that actually we're building in what will always be inflationary pressures in one form or another so that we don't get caught short. So if that's a piece of work that can be looked at, that would be appreciated. But if there's no other questions or comments from members beyond that, I do need to ask about the recommendation. Does the committee agree the recommendation set out in the report to consider and note the assurance provided in this report from the review, assessment and ongoing monitoring carried out? B, note that the head of procurement and commercial services has reached the opinion that procurement policies and practices are up to date, fit for purpose and effectively communicated. And C, note that the ongoing P2P review. Are we happy to accept that recommendation? I'll take silence as a yes. There we go. Item number 9, the interim annual governance statement. I'll pass over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Chair. This is the report bringing the interim annual governance statement, but it's a little bit different this year from what you've seen previously. Members will recall that in March of this year, you approved the local code of corporate governance as a committee, and paragraph 4.2 of that code requires that this committee has oversight of the arrangement and receives the annual reports, setting out the framework of internal control and mapping assurance prior to the approval of the AGS. Regulation 3 of the Accounts and Audit Regulations requires that the Council have in place a sound system of internal control which facilitates exercise of functions and achievement of aims and objectives, ensures effective financial and operational management, and includes effective arrangements for the management of risk. Regulation 6 goes on to require that we do an annual review, and that as a result of that annual review, we prepare the annual governance statement. So this report brings together the governance framework, which sets out what we think we do, the assurance map, which sets out the things that we can point to say, yes, we do what we think we do, and then arising out of that, the annual governance statement. You'll see from the framework and assurance map that we work along 3 lines of assurance. So we have the operational, the what's happening at the cliff face. We have the specialist assurance, which is those of us like myself on decision making, Aaron on information management, Tim comes with his risk hat on and brings that specialist assurance as to what's in place. And then on top of that, we have independent assurance coming from colleagues in internal audit and externally to the council from Grant Thornton as our external auditors, from Ofsted in terms of children's governance and so on and so forth. So this brings together the AGS. The AGS is to be published in interim form alongside the draft statement of accounts for a period of public deposit. When we've received, if we receive comments back from the public, we will update it and bring it back to members for approval. So it's here at this time for information. You may have questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Councillor Trustwell and then Councillor Illingworth.
I suppose it's a question about the dog that didn't bark to an extent in this report, and I don't mean any criticism at all of Kay, and it's about communication and the language that we use. I've become increasingly perturbed, especially when reading committee reports, for example, of the use of buzzwords, management speak, convoluted sentence, wordiness, and the continual use of the passive rather than the active tense, all of which makes it difficult to understand, certainly for this member, and certainly for members of the public. But just kind of extrapolating from that and making a plea for plain English, do we monitor and subject our communication with the public, and I'd include committee reports in this, to try and ensure that they are written in plain English? So I'm thinking more about forms and letters and website and consultation documents as well as committee reports. Because we did have a bit of a crusade a long time ago when I was a lad on this council to try and drive the plain English agenda forward. And I think we've kind of lost our way on that in many respects.
Tricky one to answer, not something that I've looked at, councillor. I
appreciate it.
I do.
I'm not expecting an authority to response here today, but I'm just flagging it up because I do think it's important.
Absolutely. I do strive to write in plain English myself, but
and I'm not quoting any examples of any report elsewhere or on this. It's just a general point that I want to ensure.
It's something I will certainly take back into the workings. It'll probably be next year before it comes out in terms of full assurance rather than being able to deliver it over the summer. But yes, I'll take it back into the workings.
And I think just for reassurance as well, when the chairs of the relevant committees across Yorkshire and Humber met, there was a similar conversation over accessibility in language and actually how you make some of this fathomable in a way that's successful. So I think it's a general piece actually that's happening across the region, and it was one of the things we discussed as chairs of the committees about how we look at it on a regional basis as well, to make sure there's a degree of consistency in language but accessible language across the region, because I think it's a fair point. Councillor Illingworth.
Looking at page 43, Chair, middle column, sorry, second column, almost on the middle of the page. And it talks about customer contact policy procedures, communication systems focus on a customer-centric approach. And I was going to challenge the customer-centric bit. And I'm thinking particularly, first of all, this is not a Leeds City Council specific problem. It's a problem for all large corporate organisations. HSBC, for example, is every bit as bad as the council, and it's a failing generally. But if you phone them up, I can tell you what the spiel says. We are currently experiencing high call volumes, and there may be a delay before your call can be answered. Please stay on the line, and we will do our best to assist you, or some paraphrase of that. And you can be stuck there for an hour and a half on the back of that message, told to hang on, but no hope at all of getting an answer from the system. And as I say, I guess that telephone answering is expensive, but it's the two elements to it. First of all, it doesn't work. And secondly, the misleading of the customer into thinking there's some purpose. If it said, we've got a monstrous queue and nobody's answering questions, it wouldn't matter. Well, it would matter a lot less, because at least people could go away and do it some other time. But it's when you're encouraged to stay and there is really no hope of a response. And I bet, well, I know the council does this. I've had 2 complaints already today about this practice. And so that's my challenge.
It might feel like a sidestep, councillor. The purpose of this report is to set out what we think we do, and then to put alongside that what we can point to say that we do it. In the what we can point to, what I've pointed to is the report that came to this committee in March, where these questions were asked. So there is that balance in there of what we strive towards, what it was accepted, I think, by officers at the committee at the time. We are still very much working towards. And you'll recall that there was then a a correspondence between the chair of this committee and the chair of scrutiny, who are looking further at that. But I will take your comment back to the officer responsible for the contact centre.
There has been 2 instances today. And it's still.
I can assure you that scrutiny is looking at this, because I've been invited to go to the next scrutiny meeting to be there while they're starting to have this conversation. So there is a focus on the contact centre and the procedures and the practice of the contact centre, but that's being dealt with at the scrutiny side rather than at the corporate governance side. But I think it's a point well noted, John. Any other questions or comments, Councillor Flynn?
First one is just really a comment. It's the risk business again. I know this is a general paper, so I wouldn't expect to see risks in there. But what I would like to see is when papers come to us in future, whatever those risks are actually outlined, not outlined, detailed in the doings. These are all the same template for every one of these agenda items for all of the meetings that I go to. And the question is, what are the key risks? And we're not seeing them, whatever they are. And the second one, again, I think is perhaps for a future meeting. I spoke at council last week about the whistleblowing policy. There's I think you put in the report, Kate, that we're the first council that's established a freedom to speak up guardian. And I think that came from the NHS, or will have come from the NHS. And while the NHS is an absolutely marvellous organisation, absolutely no criticism of it whatsoever, even their best friend would not claim that their whistleblowing policies or people who do speak up have always met with welcoming arms, quite the opposite, in fact. So I'd perhaps like to see someone from whichever section it is to come to one of our future meetings and give us a bit more information on that. Thank you.
In terms of the freedom to speak up, it's colleagues in HR who are very much in the lead on that, and they do come annually to this committee, so they'll be here. I think it's the February meeting that they're due with the employment practices report, and this would very much, I would anticipate, be something that they would deal with in that report. Whether Louise has got anything further.
Thank you, Councillor. What I did say last time we met was the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian is actually based on the NHS model, but we've created a hybrid arrangement here in Leeds. So whilst they are doing more the pastoral side of the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian, the whistleblowing responsibilities still remains with myself. So it is a version of the NHS. We are the first council to do it, but however, we are doing it a different way. So you will get assurance around the whistleblowing arrangements through myself, but the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian elements through HR.
Any other questions or comments from colleagues? Oh, I'm blurry. There we go. No, if that's the case, then we'll go on to the recommendation when I find it. Does the committee agree the recommendation set out in the report to consider and note contents of the corporate governance framework and assurance map and the interim annual governance statement? I'll take silence as a yes. Okay, moving on to item number 8, the draft statement of accounts. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Chair. So the report presents the draft statement of accounts for 2021-22. Just start with an apology that the draft accounts weren't completed in time to go out at the same time as the agenda papers. So I appreciate members won't have had very long to look at them. I'll just first start with going through the responsibilities and timescales for the statement of accounts process for the benefit of those members who are new to the committee this year. So the draft statements of accounts are approved by the Section 151 officer. There's no requirement at this stage in the process for elected members to approve the accounts. The statutory deadline we had this year for that approval was 31st of July. So we have achieved that. The public inspection period will start on Monday the 1st of August. It runs for 30 working days. During that period, members of the public can ask the council questions about figures that appear in the statement of accounts. They can put questions to Grant Thornton, our external auditors, and if they are registered as voters within the Leeds area, they can make formal objections to Grant Thornton, which Grant Thornton will then have to look into and respond to. The next stage in the process, the external audits carried out by Grant Thornton. We're expecting that to start in late September this year. And once that is completed, the final audited accounts, together with Grant Thornton's audit reports on them, will be brought back to this committee. And it's at that stage that the committee will be asked to approve those final audited accounts on behalf of the council. Appreciate the accounts are a very large and complicated document. So what we'll do, as we have done in previous years, is we'll have some informal briefing sessions for members before the final accounts are brought back, so that members can ask more detailed questions about the figures that are within those accounts. At the moment, the final accounts are timetabled to come in February, so I would propose to hold those briefing sessions in early January. But if members would prefer to have them earlier, then please do let us know. Turning to the actual statement of accounts themselves then. So there are quite a few significant differences year on year in the figures, and that's very much a reflection of the unusual 2021 figures, and that was when the main financial impact of COVID hit the council's accounts. So we've actually seen an increase in the net worth of the council year on year of £971 million. The biggest factor in that is the net pensions liability, which has actually decreased by 577 million year on year. Members who have been on the committee for some time will be aware that that pensions liability is quite a volatile figure, because accounting standards require it to be measured based on market conditions as at 31st of March each year. There's quite a scope for it to change year on year. And we saw a big increase in the pensions liability last year, and that has partly been reversed in terms of a big decrease this year. That increase and decrease, the main factors in that are the discount rate and the inflation rate. And it's the kind of relative interplay between those two assumptions that affects the gross pensions liabilities. I should say that inflation assumption, it's a long-term assumption over a 23-year period. So although it has increased slightly, it's not affected in the same ways as the sort of the very high annual inflation figures we're seeing at the moment. So you won't see an inflation assumption along those lines in the accounts. It's important to stress that the pensions liability as it appears in the account is very much an accounting assessment. It doesn't affect the employer's contributions that we pay to the pension fund. Those are driven by the triennial review, which the actuaries do, which is done on a different basis, which is more forward-looking. That actuarial review is being carried on at the moment, and we'd expect to see the results of that later on in the year. I should also add that within that net pensions figure, the earnings on the pension fund assets during the year were higher than would have been expected. So that is a good point to note. Looking at other figures on the balance sheet, the carrying value of our land and property assets has increased by 377 million, and that's after disposals of 64 million. We've seen a sort of general increase across the board in the current value of assets, but particularly in the housing stock, reflecting the sort of improvements in the housing markets over the year. Usable reserves on the balance sheet have increased by 28.6 million. The biggest impact on that is the capital usable reserves, particularly capital grants, where we receive the grants in advance of the spend actually happening. Usable revenue reserves did decrease by £8.2 million, but within that, there's the extent to which we had one-off COVID-related grants in advance that were being carried forward in reserves. Just turning to the income and expenditure account, on the face of that statement, you can see the sort of year-on-year changes in that, particularly in terms of income. So gross income for the 21-22 year has recovered quite a bit in comparison to gross income the previous year, when obviously we were affected by COVID lockdowns and services not able to earn income for various periods of the year. There's been a corresponding decrease in the government grants received, obviously, again, in the previous financial year, we were receiving quite a lot of significant COVID-related government grants to support us. And you'll also see that the income recognised from non-domestic rates has increased year on year, although that's not back to normal levels yet. It is still below the sort of levels we would have seen pre-COVID. And that is because there were still some quite COVID specific reliefs being granted to businesses during the 21-22 year as well. There's a similar pattern to that visible on the face of the cash flow statement. So again, an increase in cash flows coming in from charges for goods and services, a reduction in government grant cash flow coming in, and an increase in business rates income cash flows coming in. Just briefly on the collection fund itself, obviously we ended 2021 with a significant deficit on the collection fund. That position has improved quite significantly during the year as deficit contributions were made. There is still a sizable deficit on business rates. That's partly due to, as I mentioned, the additional reliefs that were given to businesses during that year, for which we receive grant income to compensate us. But there's also an element to which the government introduced regulations that the 2021 element of the deficit that wasn't being funded by grants could be then spread over a 3-year period. So within that deficit for business rates, there's actually 27 million that is to be recovered in 22, 23 and 23, 24 under those regulations. That was all I wanted to highlight in terms of the 21-22 accounts. Just briefly referring to the 2021 accounts, which, as you'll be aware, the audit process for that is still to be concluded. So those accounts will be brought back to the committee, to this committee to approve. So we're aware that there will be members on this committee who have not seen those 2021 accounts yet. We will have, again, a briefing session before those accounts are brought back for the final approval, particularly for the benefit of members who haven't seen the 2021 accounts yet. So we'll go through in more detail the sort of financial features of those accounts. As you'll be aware from briefing notes we circulated before the last meeting, in addition to small amount of Leeds specific issues that need to be finished on the audit, there is a national issue in relation to infrastructure assets. We did receive an update on that yesterday from SIPFA. Unfortunately, the consultation that they had carried out in June didn't result in a positive outcome. There was basically not a consensus of opinion that the way that SIPFA were proposing would be acceptable. So I think we may well, that the result of that may well be that there may be further delay in resolving at a national level these infrastructure accounting issues. I say we only got that update yesterday. I'm not sure whether or not Perminda may have anything to add from the point of view of the audit firms as to whether there could be a further delay in 2021 as a result of this.
Thanks, Mary. Just on the infrastructure asset issue, this is a national issue. You'll recall from the last meeting. There hasn't been a way forward agreed on this. At the moment, SIPFA hasn't sort of concluded something that works for everybody, and the consultation, as Mary's just alluded to, doesn't seem to have come to a way forward on it. They are, we understand, looking at a statutory override, which would sort of put that issue on one side and allow auditors to issue an opinion on the accounts. At the moment, all the firms are talking together in terms of how this may be taken forward if SIPFA is unable to come to a view on this. Once we have further information on this, we will sort of obviously share that with Victoria, Mary and the finance team, and obviously the audit committee too.
Any questions or comments on that from members? Yep, Councillor Schimmel.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your report back, because you've answered a lot of my questions and hence saved everybody's time. But I am extremely, I mean, I've not been involved that long, but I am extremely concerned about the timescales involved here with the audit completion of the accounts, and the approval by scrutiny and by us, because it butts right up against the budget setting period for the following year. And this year in particular, I know it's not the first occasion it will have happened, but there are so many unknowns and that involve potentially some very large numbers. So I'm glad you said that we would be getting briefings, but I would prefer if we could have those on a more regular basis so that we can see what progress is being made and what your particular concerns are at that point in time. For instance, the central government financial settlement won't be issued until December 22 for 23-24 financial year. So that's obviously going to be a large number and fairly critical to what the situation is going forward. But in addition, we've got the completion of the actuarial valuation estimated to be completed in December 22 as well. And if there is anything to crawl out of the woodwork, then potentially those two things could be some very large numbers, in my humble opinion. So is there anything we could do to try and expedite that procedure so that at least we are in a better situation to be able to judge what the proper estimates are for the budget going forward? Thank you.
I'm going to bring Victoria first pick on that one, because the budget and the auditing are two slightly different things, but I'll let Victoria.
Thank you, Chair. The budget is actually, it goes through executive board and then they recommend the budget to full council. That doesn't actually come through this corporate governance and audit committee. What happens is that each month, really from September, when we take the medium-term financial strategy, we report to executive board and then it goes through the scrutiny committees who then scrutinise the decisions of exec board. We then do public consultation on the budget during December, when it goes back to executive board in February, who then recommend their budget for full council, and all councils vote on that budget. What we then do as part of that is we get communication from the pension fund on the outcome of the valuation and what that implications are for the council's contribution rates. We do ask for that information earlier, but the actuaries do take a certain amount of time on having to do all the actuarial work around the valuation of the fund and what that means for our assets and our liabilities. So it takes a long time, and that's why we tend to not get it till around about December. But we have built in an assumption, because Mary and myself receive reports on where we think the pension's going to be, etc. I have regular discussions with the pension fund around what that means for the contribution rates, etc. And I make an assumption and then we refine that once we know what's actually happening. So that's on the budget side. On the accounts, that's once we've set the budget, then obviously we start to spend that budget and generate the income through the year. And the outcome is that we report that through to executive board. And then at the end of the year, Mary and her team work extremely hard to pull it all together into a set of financial accounts, which is what you've got here. Now, the progress, once Mary's team have produced the accounts, then we bring them here to go through them with yourselves. Now, I think it would be a good idea to have some briefings and not perhaps just have one, because it's 118 pages. It is quite complex to actually produce a set of accounts. As you know, accountants are training for 3 years and you're trying to scrutinise them, you know, with a days and a half training. So I think it would be good if we did different sections and went through it in some detail for you. But I would also, then you can ask some of the questions around that. We can do that throughout the year. I would also say that external audit, Grant Thornton, bring progress reports to each of the committees, and they then will say how they're doing with their audit, what the findings are, and they do that at each committee through the audit, so it's not just a surprise at the end. So you can have that information as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any follow-up? Yeah.
Thank you. That's pretty reassuring because, as I say, it won't be the first time it's happened, but we have been rightly or wrongly propped up a bit by central government grants because of COVID related issues and the difficulties with expenditure. And as yet, we don't know whether there's going to be any continuation of that, but things seem to be drawing to a close on it. So there will be a lot of one-offs on top of the uncertainties that we've already got. So the sooner we can know about it, as you say, a regular briefing will be great so that we don't get a shock at the end, and we're in a position to be able to assess what the knock-on effect is. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think Victoria's cleared up the difference between actually the budget setting process and the auditing of the accounts. I think we need to be aware of that when we're in this committee. We're not talking about the budget per se, we're talking about the auditing accounts. Councillor Dowson.
Just caught that last statement. I suspect the government grants we've been given don't match anywhere near the money we've had taken off us. But that wasn't the point. It's actually a point of just clarification when you started talking about pensions, because some of us around here, councillors, are still lucky enough to be sitting on a legacy pension. We're not decision making, so we don't have to declare an interest, I take it. Thank you. That's all I wanted to ask.
Any other questions or comments on that? Going once, going twice. Oh, well, it's been a quick agenda by the sounds of it. So going on to the recommendation, does the committee agree the recommendation set out in the report to note the unaudited statement of accounts for 2021-2022, which is to be certified by the Chief Finance Officer? I'll take silence as acceptance. There we go. Item number 11, the works programme.
As far as I know, the work programme is as attached to the final agenda item.
Any comments on the works programme? One final thing from me. Some members have said they find Friday afternoon inconvenient, and there's been a suggestion to move future meetings to the beginning of the week on a Monday. And I'm just minded to ask members that if they're happy with that, moving to a Monday slot on the morning rather than the last slot on the Friday. Any objections to that to cater for members' needs? Councillor Flynn?
Not objection there, because I would welcome the meeting being taken away, but be careful on Mondays because the shadow cabinet meetings this Monday just gone and various other things going on. So you need to have a good look at the corporate sort of diary before you do it. Okay.
No, I think that's a fair point. But over that, there's no objection to moving the meetings to the beginning slot of the week on a Monday. Yep, that's fine. Other than that, I declare the meeting over. Thank you for your time today.